Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the July installment of our monthly webinar series, Restoring Landscapes from Seeds to Success. My name is Eric Winford. I'm the Associate Director of the University of Idaho Rangeland Center, Assistant Professor of Rangeland Ecology. I'm based in Boise. And my co-host is Lauren King, Extension Educator in Benewah County. And we're really excited to have with us today Cory McCaffrey, the River Program Director with the Wood River Land Trust, who's going to be talking about a project to restore the Warm Springs Preserve, titled From Golf Course to Nature Preserve, the Warm Springs Restoration Story. How this will work today is Cory's going to give a presentation, and then we'll have time for some questions afterwards. So please use the chat or the question and answer feature to put your questions in, and then I'll ask Cory the questions once he's done with his presentation. And if you're interested in this webinar series, we have more webinars recorded on our YouTube channel, and I'll put that link in the chat. And we also have a presentation ready for August, where we're going to have Sarah Ashiglar, University of Idaho Forestry Extension Educator, talking about using silviculture to restore Idaho forest. But for this month, get ready to learn a lot about riparian and restoration with Cory. And Cory, thank you so much for joining us here today. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Eric. I appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen here real quick. Is everyone seeing that? Okay.
Yes, that looks great. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, first off, thanks, Eric, for inviting me to this webinar series and to the University of Idaho Rangeland Center. Um, I've been working on this Warm Springs Preserve project for the past 3 to 4 years, and I don't think I'll have another opportunity like it. It's one that I'll be talking about and sharing for a while. It's, to date, probably the biggest restoration project in the Bigwood River Basin. And so I'm really excited, to spend the next hour kind of talking about the story of the preserve, kind of some of the challenges, the things that we weren't expecting, things that went really well, and then kind of the nuts and bolts of the restoration project, and everything in between. So with that, um, I'm going to jump right in. Let me minimize one of my screens here. There we go. So today's question is kind of focused around how do you get an ambitious restoration vision into an on-the-ground project in 3 years? So I'm anticipating that most of you are already kind of familiar with the restoration life cycle. So I'm not going to spend much time kind of walking through the traditional steps, but instead I want to use Warm Springs as a case study on what happens in between those steps. So how we develop the vision, how we engage the community, translated objectives into design, how we assembled some of the partnerships, some of the materials that we used to build the project, and then and really at how we adapted the project from the paper, the plans, the design to on the ground work. So having been working in the industry of restoration for almost a decade, I think it's pretty rare to see a project go from zero to built in this short amount of time. And I was really just surprised by how fast this project came together, given the scale. I've seen some projects take 10 to 15 years in some cases to make it to the ground. So much of the success, I think, was really due to a great partnership with the city of Ketchum, and then we had a consultant and design team that was really, really dialed, and then also having the philanthropic and community support to kind of bring all of this vision to life. So some of the other key players I want to mention before jumping into this is the Friends of the Warm Springs Preserve. We also work closely with the Bureau of Reclamation. We received a grant from them, which funded a big part of this project. The U.S. Forest Service. We had a lot of great construction contractors and worked well with a lot of the regulatory agencies. So Warm Springs, the property was acquired in April of 22, and we started moving dirt in June of 25, just to give you some frame of reference. So the deployment of a project is really contingent on the scale and complexity, and this one included both of those. So it was a fun one. I'm excited to kind of see it come to an end, but it'll be a little bit bittersweet. Before we get into the project specifics, I just want to spend a second talking about the land trust. Um, our mission is to protect and sustain the treasured landscapes and the life-giving waters of the Wood River Valley and inspire love for this place for generations to come. It's a place that I'm really proud to work for. We're a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. We have a staff that kind of fluctuates around 11 people and 4 different departments. So far, we've protected about 30,000 plus acres. We have 21 public access preserves, 46 conservation easements. And then in my department, the river program, we've restored about 15 miles of the Big Wood and its tributaries. And so my role really as the river program director, I kind of think of myself as like an integrator. I help move river restoration projects from concept through implementation. Um, and then kind of mixed in with that, I oversee some monitoring programs that help inform existing projects and then future efforts as well. So where are we talking about? Most of you are probably familiar with this area. This is kind of a zoom out of Ketchum, Sun Valley, and in the middle is the Warm Springs Preserve. So it kind of abuts Bald Mountain, which is where the Sun Valley Ski Resort is. Ketchum is just a short walk to the east. Um, and Warm Springs Creek is the largest tributary of the Big Wood River. If we get a little more granular, we'll zoom in here. You can see the parcel boundaries. This was taken before any of the project had gotten started. You can see it's kind of a mix of conifer forest, and then some of the green spots are the old fairway, which used to be a former golf course. I'll get into that here next. So the story of Warm Springs is a pretty common trope throughout the West. A lot of streams, a lot of rivers kind of have a similar background where, this spot at Warm Springs Preserve is near the intersection of the Big Wood River. So at one point it was probably a pretty vast wetland and floodplain area, which also made it easy to develop, easy to farm, easy to ranch. So inevitably, that's kind of what it turned into. Um, so that was kind of at the turn of the century. There was a farm and a restaurant into the 1950s. So it's used for agriculture. And then around 1960, it changed hands and was turned into a 9-hole golf course. And so to build the golf course, what they did is they took some of the material from what I guess we call the southern floodplain, which is just south at the southern end of the preserve, brought it up into the main area that's kind of runs east to west, and built these large terraces, pushed the creek over to the residential side and kind of locked it into place, and then had these 3 terraces that were the golf course. The golf course had a restaurant on site. They had these fishing ponds where you could go catch your dinner. From what I hear, it was very popular, fun place to be. But then in 2009, changed hands again to a developer. And kind of between 2009 to 2022, the community used it as a dog park, and it kind of colloquially was known as the Ketchum Dog Park. Which brings us to the acquisition. So the threat of development kind of lingered here for a while, kind of following that 2008 recession. And then around 2021, the community kind of rallied together with the city of Ketchum and the land trust to put together funds to protect the property in perpetuity. So the price tag was $8 million, And then there was an additional $1 million raised for replacing the really outdated irrigation system that was put in the 1960s. So it was definitely a community effort. There was 950 plus donors that were part of the acquisition. And some of there was deed restrictions with the purchase, and some of those included things like there was going to be a public restroom, floodplain restoration, 24 parking stalls, storage and maintenance buildings, walking trails, and a couple more. But in any event, Ketchum took over the property in 2022, and that kind of set the stage for long-term restoration and really kind of the community having questions about, okay, like now we have this property, what are our options here? And that's kind of initially when the land trust really started getting involved, as the city invited us to kind of come on and tag along as experts in the field of restoration. So the first thing we did is we hired some consultants, and we needed some folks to conduct a site analysis to really determine what is possible at the site. I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned from past projects is that I think it helps to start with some idea of what's feasible first and really have a firm grasp on the direction of the project before engaging in public outreach. Because it's no fun to bring an exciting project like this to the public with anything on the table when in reality there's certain environmental factors and constraints at play that doesn't make quite everything possible. So in order to figure all that out, we did a couple different things. We looked at different vegetation types throughout the property just to get an understanding of what was already there, what were the different ecotones we're working with. We ran some hydraulic analysis to understand kind of like the flooding implications, a geomorphic assessment, and then again, those limiting environmental factors and existing constraints at the site. So what were those? What was already known before the I guess visioning process even happened was that we had this really outdated irrigation system um, that was really wasteful. It uses twice as much water as a nearby park in Ketchum that's roughly the same size. It was manually operated during the day. We also knew that the creek was pretty much one homogeneous riffle, lacked habitat diversity and wood. Um, wasn't well known, by the local angling community as a good fishing spot. Much of the older lower fairway had transitioned into non-native weeds, and so it's kind of this homogeneous monoculture of weeds in what used to be a former fairway. When we got to the discovery phase, some of the new things we learned is that the hydraulic modeling indicated there was really no floodplain connectivity even at a 100-year flood event, which is almost unheard of. The creek was extremely incised. So that was a bit shocking. We also learned that the riparian corridor was very, very narrow. It made up very little of the property compared to some of the control reaches further up along Warm Springs Creek. Another interesting feature from the geotechnical survey was that the water table was about 8 to 9 feet below the surface, which also was just really, really surprising, given that historically this was probably, a confluence wetland area that would be inundated periodically. The extent of the non-native plant community exceeded over 20 acres, which was roughly a third of the property. So we knew there was a lot of work to do there on that front. And then I guess one of the silver linings was that there were several water rights affiliated with the property that were stacked, one with a senior priority date back to 1888. So we knew if we were to do restoration here, if we were to get plants on the ground, we would have water in place to make sure those got established and could continue watering the upper fairways as kind of recreational areas. So once we had that piece figured out, what our limiting factors were, the next piece was community engagement. We wanted to build not just a vision, but a shared vision with the community. This was a project that came together from the efforts of the community. And so we wanted this to be driven by everyone. And engagement wasn't something we did after the design, it helped influence the design. Um, so this outreach and kind of integration process, this getting this feedback took a little over a year. And so what we did is we had 10 public meetings between September of 22 to February of 23. We had some online surveys that we put out where we got 400 plus responses on those. We had a couple city council and planning and zoning commission meetings. Um, we also did tabling days at the preserve where Ketchum staff or land trust staff would go out, have a table and just talk to dog walkers and hear what people were thinking about the parcel and what it might be. And then lastly, we did some site tours and walks. And we learned a lot of good stuff. And I think one of the biggest things was that, this is a really big project. It's 65 acres, and the area had been used for, over a decade a certain way. And so there was a lot of competing interests. And so the visual here is just kind of a stakeholder map of all of the different players that were involved with this project. But just to give you some context on these competing interests, a neighbor might be interested in seeing reduced flood risk. A donor might want to see some visible conservation impact. A lot of what we heard from the broader community is that it's a place that it needs to be accessible, it needs to be walkable, and we'd also like to see it use less water on the landscape. Dog walkers might want, an off-leash space that's safe for dogs. A lot of times we heard the opposite of that. People don't want to see any dogs. If you're part of the angling community, you'd like to see better trout habitat, better fishing. And then, for the city of Ketchum, as the landowners, they're thinking about how do we make this manageable in the long term, for maintenance and for stewardship. So that was a big piece. If you're a landscape architect, designing this, they might want more of a built park environment that looks really nice on a resume. And then for us at the Land Trust, we wanted to see, a natural landscape supporting fish and wildlife and keeping some of that water for in-stream uses. So the the biggest challenge was receiving all of these wants and needs from these different user groups, these different stakeholders, and combining it all into one package. And it was really an exercise of finding the overlap between these different uses. So we were able to distill that down into some commitments. And some of these were driven by the deed restrictions from the get-go. But we had these 10 major takeaways following the outreach that supported the deed restrictions that we found in the online surveys and the in-person feedback. And the things that chronically kept coming up was that we need a new irrigation system here. The old one is really wasteful. Flood mitigation is a priority. The 2017 flood put a lot of homes at risk. The one that popped up probably most prominently was that people wanted to see the creek and the floodplain restored. That was a big one. A passive park for open space, off-leash dog access, some informal activities like frisbee golf, some informal gathering spaces with picnic benches, Nordic trails in the wintertime, and a public restroom. So we had those commitments in place, which was great. And then the project partners and the design team, we worked to develop 6 principles that describe the goals, the values, and the themes kind of more universally that were important to the community and against which we tested some of these design scenarios. So the Land Trust, Ketchum, and the consultants we're really just facilitators in bringing this vision to life. I'm going to focus on the 5th principle moving forward because it's probably most topical to this group. And so once we had these established, it was really time to get to designing the project and really looking at what our funding options were and what we could accomplish given the vision that was in place. So once we had an agreement around those objectives, the next challenge was translating those objectives into specific treatments. Floodplain connectivity became excavation and building side channels. Habitat complexity became the installation of large wood, removal of bank armoring throughout Warm Springs Creek. Water conservation became a new irrigation system and conversion to native drought tolerant vegetation. But none of those decisions really happened in isolation. We were simultaneously testing them against, the hydraulics, the infrastructure, um, the restoration or the recreation, the cost of all this, the constructability, and still keeping those stakeholder concerns in mind. And so one of the big pieces of that is we needed to figure out a way to source plants as native as possible. So for all of our 5-gallon containerized riparian and floodplain species, um, these were selected and cut from some of the land trust preserves in the winter of 2024. So we got a lot of these from Simon's Bower, which is off of Croy Creek, just west of Haley, and then also the Colorado Gulch Preserve, just to the south of that. And then we worked with North Fork Native Plants, who's out of Rexburg, and they propagated those plants at the nursery. And then we established a nursery contract with those guys for some more of the like forbs and shrubs and herbaceous plants. And then for some of the large kind of bagged and burlap stuff, which was primarily conifers, we source those from the local nursery. I think it was Webb's or Whitehead's or something like that. And then the seed mixes were really determined by these different hydrology zones, which we can kind of look at here on the next slide. It's a little fuzzy, but it kind of gives you an idea of how hydrology played into determining these character zones. So if you looked at the bottom left, we have mix A kind of all throughout what we're calling this middle terrace area. This is one of the areas that received some of the spoils from the floodplain excavation. And so this was more of an upland area, didn't see a lot of water other than what it got through irrigation. So that was going to receive more upland species. As we get down towards the Baldy side channel, kind of in the middle there, you can see in green, we have a lot of like wetland sod. We have a lot of mix C, and then as you kind of work up in topography, the mixes kind of change based on how much water is going to be received, with the thought that once irrigation's in place, we can turn those heads off and let the stuff, that's down in the floodplain, it won't need to be irrigated any longer. Um, this visualization is really just a simplified version of the entire process, year 1 through year 3. But in essence, this is the sequencing that had to happen for the project to really come together in the abbreviated time frame that everyone was, kind of hoping for. And many of the activities in the rows are happening in parallel tracks with each other. Um, the agency coordination was happening throughout that process. And then the permitting wasn't something we did after the design. It was something we started very, very early on. And then that way we were able to use that agency feedback to help shape the design as it evolved. And this was a really helpful process. And so by the time we reached final plans, we had already worked through many of those regulatory considerations. And so we didn't have too many hangups. I say too many with an asterisk. Once we had somewhat of a design in place, permitting was underway. It really came down to figuring out like, okay, now we have construction estimates for how much this is going to cost. We know now kind of what the material costs might be. Um, what does that funding look like? And so this is just a simple table showing the partnership and funding architecture. I won't get into the details here, but it just lists, kind of who's involved, what their role was. The key funders here being the city of Ketchum, the land trust, the Friends of the Warm Springs Preserve was, just maybe 8 or 9 folks from the community or that lived in the neighborhood, and were really critical to kind of convening fundraising for the effort. The Bureau of Reclamation also was a major funder in this project. So this leads us to the fun part, the construction and the establishment. So getting those plans onto the ground. And I'm kind of just going to present it by the numbers and not get into too much of the nitty gritty. I'll use these visuals to kind of illustrate, some of the impacts. So one of the things we knew we wanted was to reestablish a new floodplain. So we built 8 acres of floodplain by excavating about 40,000 cubic yards of material. We dropped the existing grade by about 4 to 5 feet. We included some swales and some high points to kind of give it a natural topography feeling, and then take on some of those spring runoff events, and help minimize some of the risk to neighbors. One of the other benefits of this is helping recharge some of the groundwater that had been so depleted from bringing in fill for the construction of the golf course. We also built a 2,000 linear foot side channel. It's called the Baldy channel. You can kind of see it in the middle of the screen here, which was built with pools and riffles and wood. It offers kind of ideal spawning and rearing conditions for trout at different life stages, particularly during spring runoff. Also helps to recharge groundwater locally. And a big piece of this is that it was necessary to help keep moving water continuously throughout the system and feed the irrigation pond. In Warm Springs Creek and along the side channel, we installed roughly 40 large woody debris structures. Most folks here, probably familiar with this, but provides habitat complexity for trout, helps with sediment sorting, also offers cover for juvenile adult trout. And this is really a key component to nearly all restoration projects in the Northwest, where a lot of these streams have been very simplified with water delivery in mind. This next piece was a 1 acre wetland complex that we constructed, and this is probably one of my favorite parts about the entire project. The design team thoughtfully put this together with the intent that we see a lot of use on the preserve. We see a lot of dog waste on the preserve. And so how do we get that dog waste into some way, into a place where it can be filtered? And so a lot of the topography kind of lends itself down into the side channel, which feeds into the wetland. And I learned that a 1 acre wetland of this size can filter about 7.3 million gallons of water annually. So this was a treatment that I was really fond of. I thought it was really well done and thoughtful. And I'm excited to see how it kind of fills in over the next year or two. Probably one of the biggest pieces in the budget, some of the biggest line items was the planting. We knew this was a very public space, a heavily used space. There's a lot of eyes on it, and we didn't want it to feel like an open sandbox when we got done with the project. So we spent a lot of money, a lot of time getting plants in, roughly 30,000 plus native plants, which included everything from trees, shrubs, um, herbs, you name it, seeds. Um, and to protect those plants, part of this included exclusion fencing throughout most of the preserve to help minimize some of the predation from deer and elk and moose, which we commonly see throughout Warm Springs Preserve. One piece that was new to me that I kind of learned through this project, and that I thought was a really smart idea, is that we built in warranty and weed mitigation into the contract with North Fork Native, who did all of the plant installation, which I thought was a really good way to do it because it makes the design process that much more thoughtful when you're the one installing it and making sure that it performs. You do a really good job of thinking through it. So that was a nice piece that I hadn't done in past projects. Usually, the land trust, we're on the hook for that. But it's nice to have that 1 year warranty in place. The last big piece here was we installed kind of 2 new irrigation ponds, one with the thought that it could be used as kind of a dog play area. We heard a lot of concerns and gripes about dogs getting stuck in the pre-existing pond. So we made it a little more gradually sloped. And then the upper part of it is used for feeding the irrigation system. So this new irrigation system does cover basically the entire preserve. It's a new automated system that runs at night. Um, it can shut off heads throughout the floodplain and middle terraces once those plants get established. And we're hopeful we can kind of turn those off after 2 years and leave that water for in-stream use. And so we think we should be able to save about 50 million gallons of water usage annually, which is pretty great. When thinking about this project, there was a lot of opportunities to create efficiencies. And so I just wanted to point a few of those out, which were um, really helpful for cost savings or building partnerships and getting the project across the finish line. So one of these was partnering with the U.S. Forest Service. They were the kind of adjacent landowner to the south of the preserve. And they work with the National Forest Foundation on doing forest thinning projects throughout Bald Mountain. So we leveraged that, teamed up with them to get all of our large woody material basically on site. And so this helps with minimizing the kind of wildfire urban interface, helps minimize, those bark beetle outbreaks. And then the big part for us is that it kept the mobilization costs down substantially because we were just mobilizing, 100 yards from the forest to the preserve, which was really great to just have that timber sourced locally. The other efficiency was that we didn't have to remove any of the spoils offsite. All of that material we removed out of the floodplain remained on site, which was great. And so you can see in the visual here, we have a rock and soil sifter and screen, which we use to sort the soils into usable materials. So this would be like using cobble for the side channel construction, sifting it out for dirt that we use for the plantings and the topsoil, and then using some of the thinner gravel for the subgrade. So that was a really nice approach. The last one involved the former headgate. You can see the picture on the left is the diversion headgate that was used to feed the old irrigation system. And so what we did is we replaced that with natural materials. So we had log jams. We revegetated kind of that point there. And that allowed the point of diversion to be the new irrigation ponds where the usage could be more accurately monitored. So this kind of negated the need for any new water rights or a water right application, which can take quite a bit of time to finalize. And then just for some context, I kind of wanted to show you some aerials of the before. There you can see the parking lot kind of in the middle. Here's what it looked like during construction. It does kind of have that big sandbox look. But you can kind of start to see the outlines of some of the swales and side channels that were being built. And then this was just from about a month ago, where we're at about 90% completion. You can see irrigation's working, the side channel's all done. We have a new welcome building. You can kind of see in the upper left there. That was constructed this winter. This has bathrooms and a maintenance shed, as that was part of the deed restrictions. And so it's not the final product, but it's kind of what we got at this point. I think by next year, this should look very well polished. And then one of the things I wanted to touch on too was how are we assessing performance? And luckily, because we kind of knew this project was on the horizon for a while, we started early and have about 2 or 3 years of pre-data for a couple different things. What we do at the preserve, and really all of our restoration projects, is we establish photo points. This is kind of just best management practice for all projects, so you can understand how things change over time. With those photo points, we also do drone aerials at all of our projects. I think that is one of the probably most underutilized tools that exist for doing this work. Red spawning surveys or trout nests. We look at those in the springtime to see if trout are utilizing some of the areas we constructed. We do macroinvertebrate monitoring. When I started in 2022 here at the Land Trust, that was one of the first things we got going, and we have 2 or 3 years of pre-data at Warm Springs. So I'm excited to see how the community assemblage shifts as a result of this project. And then the last one, we've partnered with Portland State University on some nutrient cycling research, which is some really pretty cool contemporary analysis on um, nutrient spiraling in streams and how nutrients move through the food web. I'm not going to get into the details of that, as that's probably a whole presentation in itself. But I did include a QR code here, which will take you to a Vimeo of a presentation we did 2 or 3 years ago with Dr. Pat Edwards from Portland State about the research and also how it's related to Warm Springs Preserve. So some of the things we learned, some of the challenges. It should be no surprise to most people, but inflation was real. Some of the costs that came in were a lot higher than some of our construction estimates. And so we had to do some value engineering on how do we stay aligned with the principles without losing too much of the project. And so really one of the only big pieces we lost as part of this was there's a southern floodplain area at the southern part of the preserve, and we had some treatments established down there, but weren't able to get to those as part of these funding gaps. So we're looking to do that in future phases. The other one I think I found most challenging is balancing recreation versus restoration. When we were working on developing this project, we knew this area got a lot of use, and so keeping that in mind while trying to accomplish the conservation goals was a constant struggle, and it was kind of a back and forth the entire time. It's nice when you get to work on areas, out in the middle of nowhere or rural areas, because that becomes less of a concern. But this one um, it's a very heavily used area. Um, the next one was crowded construction space. We had at sometimes 4 or 5 different contractors working on site, and they were all working on top of each other. So maintaining open communication and positive relationships between the contractors was vital, and it's sometimes challenging. Another piece was water availability. We anticipated putting a lot of our plants in the ground last year, but a lot of the water was curtailed throughout the basin. So we kind of had to pivot, leave some plants at the nursery, and a lot of that went in this year, which wasn't how we anticipated the project going, but it ended up working out. Another piece, I guess, on the flip side of that is too much water. So managing runoff, we had to kind of play a cat and mouse game with runoff and our inlet, and just making sure that a lot of the wetland sod that we established didn't get oversaturated or undersaturated. Um, the next one, keeping the preserve open, this kind of ties back into balancing recreation and restoration. It's just hard doing a project with heavy equipment. It can be kind of dangerous, and still managing access to the preserve, which is one of Ketchum's key priorities as the project was going along. We did close it a few times, but tried to minimize that as much as possible. The other one, again, probably not surprising to this group, is permitting turnaround. Some permits, especially the FEMA Clomar Lomar, took 9, 10 months, as well as the NEPA review was almost a year. And so luckily we kind of built that into our planning scheme, but those do take a long time, especially for a project of this scale that's federally funded. Lastly, wetland sod is expensive and inherently finicky, so I don't know if I'd use that in a project again. What worked though, at least for this project, I think I could say the same for all of our project, is that it's good to get the community involved early and often. This avoids any surprises, and keeping people engaged and informed is always the way to go. Um, the next one is finding efficiencies. We talked about that. defining outcomes before treatments. I think sometimes it's easy to get into thinking about the what instead of the why. So thinking about outcomes first, finding overlapping objectives with stakeholders, partners, um, and then running those processes in tandem with each other, the permitting, the funding, the design. Um, it's good to do those all at once while you can. Just some wins from the project that we've learned so far. Again, this project just kind of got wrapped up this year in total, but we've already seen trout come in and start utilizing some of the log jams that we built this spring, which, for us, I think really made it feel like it was all worth it. We saw groundwater return when we had a volunteer planting day this spring, and a lot of the volunteers were planting in a couple inches of water, which was great to see. We did observe some reds, some trout nests in the project reach, so that's nice to see that they're utilizing the new space, and plants and seeds are establishing successfully. So I think with that, Eric, I'm done with my presentation. Um, there's a QR code on the screen of our Warm Springs Preserve film that we put together. And so that's kind of a nice 10-minute blip of the project in its entirety. And so you can click that and it'll take you there.
Awesome. Thank you so much,
Thank you so
Corey,
much
for
for
sharing that really thoughtful and in-depth story.
story,
Really fascinating
fascinating
process you
process
have
you
going
have on
there.
there.
If folks want to add some questions to the Q&A box or the chat, please do, and we'll get to the questions. I think I had a couple of questions, and you kind of hit on this with some of the monitoring that you're doing, but I'm kind of curious about the like adaptive management, and maybe that's included in the the contract that you were doing with the North Fork, which was to monitor to take care of weeds 1 year after. That's pretty fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about that and like what are the triggers for that and how you're going about looking at that?
Yeah, I mean, we have some fine print in the specifications and within the contract about, like what the cover like allowable coverage is and the allowable like performance of the plants. So it's just a matter of determining like what's industry standard, what's acceptable. Um, I know in Blaine County, like for their stream alteration permit, you have to have, I think, an 80% success rate on plantings. I don't recall if we were that stringent. Um, but yeah, the warranty piece is just a cool tool that people should be using if they have, a contractor they're working with locally that, has the opportunity to come back and take care of their work. Um, I think going forward, if the project allows, I'd like to start baking that into all of our contracts.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I mean, with as much earth as you moved, as much disturbance as was there, there's likely to be a lot of uh, non-natives that could be established if you don't jump on those.
Totally, and it's not something that's going to be accomplished, in less than a year.
Yeah. Okay, a couple of questions are jumping in. One is about the funding coming from the Bureau of Reclamation. Could you talk about that? The a lot of times people think of Bureau of Rec as just sort of the engineers who build the dams,
Yep.
but in this situation, they're really interested in the free-flowing river.
Yeah, yeah, no, the Bureau Rec actually has a lot of great funding opportunities through Water Smart, and it's kind of always been on our radar. The one that I applied to was the Environmental Water Resources Program grant. Since the administration change, I think, changed it a little bit as a new name, but it's more or less the same program, and it's even, I think, a little more focused on um, nature-based solutions, restoration. And I think with the Bureau Rec stuff, as long as there's like a water delivery or water savings nexus, um, I think the Bureau Rec is fond of seeing those projects, even if they're just purely restoration. If you can quantify that there's some water savings or, you're banking water or reconnecting floodplain areas. It's a worthy funding opportunity to look into.
That's some good points. Okay, a couple of others here. What methods did you use to seed the areas, and were there any methods that worked the best?
I can answer the first part of that. It was they used drill seeding throughout a lot of the more like upland, middle terrace areas. They just accomplished that about 2 weeks ago. Some of it has already started coming in on the middle terrace, but it's a little early to tell. I couldn't say if it's working well or not. In the past, on our other restoration projects, we just do it by hand and then spread it with a rake. And I've found that as long as things are getting water, especially for the seeds, they're going to take really well.
Okay, and you are using irrigation for those plantings, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, we have irrigation throughout the entire preserve pretty much. But again, we're hopeful that in 2 years we can turn a lot of that off and it'll be established.
Did you time the seeding? Was it based on a timing of kind of season or soil moisture or anything?
No, because we can kind of control that, which is
Okay.
nice.
Yeah.
In other projects where we don't have irrigation, yes, that is definitely like a fall, autumn, October exercise, at least for this part of the world. But when you have irrigation, it gives you a lot of flexibility. And this is the first project where we've done it in July. So it's kind of a shocker to me. But if you're getting water on it, then it stays happy.
Okay. So, question sounded like there was a notable grade break at the on the upstream end of the project. And how was this addressed geomorphologically to avoid head cuts?
I guess was this in the side channel or the main creek? The question probably doesn't have that information in there.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I guess, but it looked like you were adding a lot of sinuosity to the channel in the main
okay,
channel.
main channel. Um, I mean the creek bottom in Warm Springs is pretty armored
Hmm.
and it doesn't have a terribly steep grade. We didn't we didn't do a terribly lot of regrading in Warm Springs Creek. Again, we had a lot of large wood. We did put in some pools. Um, but when the consultant team was just going through the engineering process, we tried to keep grade slopes, you know, around one or less than one throughout Warm Springs Creek, 1%. So I don't anticipate we'll see any head cuts. It's too large of a stream, and there's so much sediment moving through, likely in part to that Castle Creek fire that happened. I think that was in 2007 or something.
Okay. Okay. Keep on adding some questions if you have any more. But one thing I was curious about was the wetland sod. You said if finicky, so I'm assuming that didn't take.
It's not that it didn't take, it's just when you're working with wetland species, they're hydrophytic and they just have a narrow band or a narrow range of what they need to survive. Um, so we're constantly playing this game with like how much water do we let into the inlet? Do we close some of it up? Do we let more water in? Plus irrigation is going on. And it's just it was an expensive line item that it looks really great. Um, but it takes a little more attention to get it established, unlike, native seeds, uh, willows, cottonwood, some of the forbs, some of that stuff just grows like a weed. So the wetland sod was just a little more touch and go.
Constantly needing some care. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
If you wouldn't use that again, what would you use?
probably nothing. We haven't used that on any of our other projects, with the creeks fluctuating. so much, from year to year. You have a pretty high potential for erosion. So I think it's one of the things we're going to have to watch carefully. And I don't know what success will look like, having not used it before. Um, but we'd probably just seed the area and then use willows. That's what we would normally do on a project.
The question, are there contiguous parcels of land that could benefit from a similar project?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned towards the end there, the southern floodplain. So part of the parcel to the south, I think it's about 15 acres. We didn't get to that this go round because of just some funding gaps and prices going up, for construction. So we're looking to do that one hopefully next year. It's going to be, again, kind of a run-of-the-mill restoration where we reconnect the floodplain, add large wood. Uh, the weed situation down there is pretty out of control, so we look to treat that as well. Other than that, most of the area, I mean, this is a 5-minute drive to downtown Ketchum, so it's very residential, very developed. The resort's near there. Um, as we go up further, Warm Springs, we're looking for other opportunities, but nothing that's, I guess, adjacent to the project.
Speaking of weeds, there was a question about what are you going to do for weed management? What methods?
Yeah, so most of it is spot spraying. So now that we have seeds in the ground, we're not doing any broadcast spraying. Um, this summer and into next year, it'll be mostly just spot spraying. I'm not 100% sure which chemical they use. I don't believe it's glyphosate. It might be some water, kind of non-toxic water formulation. I'm not sure.
Well, great. I think that's all of our questions coming in. So thank you so much, Cory, for sharing that. This has been recorded, so we'll be putting this on our YouTube channel. And then for anybody interested, come back next month, August 27th, for the speaker Sarah Ashigar on using silviculture to restore Idaho forest. And in the meantime, send us any ideas that you have or topics that you'd like to talk about. I guess with that, yeah, Cory, really, really appreciate it. Thanks for sharing all your knowledge and great work out there. Looking forward to driving up there soon and checking it out.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. I appreciate it. I like talking about this project. It was a good one. And yeah, if anyone would like to see the project in person, feel free to reach out. We're happy to do tours and show people the lay of the land.
Cool. Appreciate it. Thank y'all.
Thank you.